For coming. As Lunchen said, I will try to present you not what the studio that I created does. The point is not to show you a portfolio of my work, but more to make you understand what are the processes of exhibition and museum design and how we try to work and how we are trying on a couple examples, museums and temporary exhibition, to show you what is the creative process? How do you get and how do you design an exhibition or a museum, and how I try, at least in my studio, to do it. And maybe to start with is to explain you that I'm not an architect, and I'm actually a designer and a cabinet maker by training, and therefore my relationship to the world and to the objects is very much at the scale of the hand. And this is a pocket knife from France, a very typical, iconic Opinel, which is like the typical pocket knife in France. And I show it to you because I believe that the way you take things in hands, the way you observe things, can generate often the best solutions or the best response if they come from within and they're not like paste, they're not artificially veneered onto a project, but rather come from very much inside. And if you look at anything sufficiently long and you analyze it, well, everything can become of interest. And the pocket knife you've seen and this lamp is exactly the same thing. And it's the same principle. The blade is the stand, and the wooden part, the handle, is the lampshade. And if you think of a lamp which is working this way, you can actually alternate from direct to directed to indirect light. And this lamp is actually a product that I designed 20 years ago, and that was such a success that it allowed me to build my studio. And we have sold about, I don't know, probably over 2 million of these lamps with Artemide, which is an Italian lamp producer. And from design and product design, I moved on to museum design through exhibitions in the first place, exhibition on furniture, and then slowly from temporary exhibition to more permanent exhibition and museum. But I believe that the practice of design, this relationship with the scale, has brought me to understand, or has nourished my practice very much so. And in each of these projects and others that they're not on the slide, I believe that I've always tried to find solution, as I was saying, from within, from how to find a solution which is from the subject itself, from the topic itself, from the collection, from the architecture, and not something that I would very pleasingly put, but that would be exogenous. And I think it's very important to find solutions that are endogenous, that come from within the subject. There's a very nice word in French, and it exists in English. I don't know if there's its equivalent in Chinese, which is to apprehend. And apprehend means to take in hand. But it's also, apprehending is to understand the circumference of something. You embrace something. And apprehension is when you're scared of something. You don't know exactly what it is. And I believe that my job in exhibition and museum design is precisely to allow people to apprehend things, take them in hand, make them theirs, feel totally empowered, and also go beyond their apprehension. If you succeed in doing that, then I believe then you can bring people wherever you want to bring them. The Musée du Louvre-Lens is the first kind of example I want to take you inside to understand the mechanism of this museum that we built with Sejima and Nishizawa, which is Sana architect, the Japanese famous Pritzker Prize architect, and with Catherine Mosbach, who was the landscape designer. And this project is very much in the legacy of the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, the idea of reaching out and decentralization, which is to reach out population and zones and territories that have been probably left down in terms of cultural tools, museums, and cultural access. So it's really a project about accessibility, and how you get people to be welcomed and to feel entitled. And this idea of access was present in the landscape design. It's a very long park in which you have 10 entrances. It's also within the architecture with this very anti-Gehry architecture to a certain extent, because it's very humble, it's very delicate, it's very low profile, it's not bursting, it's not bragging, it's very delicate. And so there is 10 entrances in the park, so people can arrive from different parts. There's not one single entrance. And the building functions as the main foyer. You can enter from the north, from the west, from the east, or from the south. So there's this idea of a very walking journey where you can enter in this building from all around. And from there, the main gallery, a permanent gallery of the Louvre-Lens, called the Galerie du Temps, is a single room of 125 meter long and 25 meter wide, which is approximately a football field in length and half in width. So it's a very, very large, quite unique room. And it was very important for me to respect the architecture of Sejima and Nishizawa. In this sense, I didn't want to build anything in this architecture. I didn't want to build any boxes. I didn't need, because I'm not an architect, I didn't need to show that I could build an architecture within the architecture. It's not my point. What my point was is, how do you make people enter a room of 3,200 meters square and not feel intimidated, not feel like overwhelmed? And a solution I suggested to Sejima was to exactly create a position like I am right now, which is to create a terrace, which is to create a position in height so that this would be the same floor level than the foyer, and people would dominate the gallery and see its end. And the people are in a position of domination. And as we have a slope all along the gallery, which was planned by Sejima and Nishizawa, of 0.3%, it means that when you are here, you're 50 centimeters higher from there and 80 centimeters higher from there, which is a real great height. It's like if you're standing on the table. So it's quite a position of empowerment. You know, when you're doing a trek or you're walking in the mountains or in the valleys, and you arrive at a point, an upper point, and you dominate the valley, and you say, okay, I'm going to go down there, I'm going to go this way. Well, this is the same feeling. To put people in a position where they're going to choose their way, because there is no room. There is no one way to do this Galerie du Temps. There is as many ways as you can invent. And another thing which was very important is that Henri Loiret, the former director of the Louvre, wanted this gallery to be a chronological journey in the collections of the Louvre. So the Louvre in Paris is an encyclopedic museum. You go to the Louvre and you see Italian Renaissance painting, or you go see Flemish primitive paintings, or you go see Italian Renaissance sculptures. But you cannot see those together. If you go to the department of sculptures, you cannot see the department of paintings at the same time. The project of Henri Douaret was to create a gallery in which, for the first time, people could see in dialogue and in a chronological way the collections of the Louvre, or some of the collections of the Louvre. So that transparency, or that transversality, that capacity of putting artifacts in dialogue, is something which was at the core of the scientific project. And then I have this room which is so long and so big. So obviously you could not put any artifacts on the walls, because if you put artifacts on the walls, you have to interrupt the walls, because imagine you have paintings all along this wall. It would be very boring. You would go painting, wall, label, painting, wall, label, painting, wall, label, exit. You run away. It's over. You don't want to stay. So you have to create something where you escape the walls. So we decided with Sejima, we're thinking about this, and we said, okay, let's make sure no one puts ever anything on the walls. So we decided to clad the walls with the same frosted aluminium that was on the outside of the building, and in somehow erase the wall, just make them vanish, because we would have only the reflection of the public and of the artifacts together. And the artifacts is almost like the ghosts of all the artifacts that are still in Paris and didn't go up to Lens. And the only thing we decided to have on the aluminium was a kind of a rule of time, an element that would give the bit and the rhythm of the gallery, but also will allow you to know where you are in time, because the collections of the Louvre are not the same in time and in quantity. For the very old civilization, your steps might be 500 years or maybe 1,000 year a step. But at the end, in the 19th century or in the 18th century, you might make 10 years steps, because the collections are way more important. So this idea of working on this scale of time so that people understand where they are in the collection and that they understand where the artifacts belong in time was an element which was very important to us. So as you can see in the time lapse, it's all about creating the right circulation and deambulation. There's a great amount of philosophy in Asia as well as in Europe about how much you can learn by walking in the forest, walking in the mountains. Rousseau walked a lot in the mountains. And the idea of the walking making the meaning, it's by walking that you get your ideas, and it's by walking that you understand things. In this gallery, it was almost a work of choreography, in the sense that we are choreographing the movement of the public. You see, for example, in theater, the director will play with the actors and they're moving on stage and the public is static as you are. Well, museum is right the contrary. My artifacts and my actors are static. I'm putting them there, here, there, but I'm putting them in a very position so that I invite you to move among them. And this movement creates meaning, creates understanding, invites you to make connections, to draw bridges, to walk with your mind, with your eyes, and to make connections. Maybe connections we anticipated, maybe connections that are yours, that you make up. And this gallery is very cinematographic in a way, because the format is already very cinematographic. It's like a cinemascope, like old Hollywood movies, very like 6 meters, 25 meter, and 125 meter deep. So it's a very screen format. But what is very cinematographic also about this exhibition design is that we work on the off-screen, what is hors champ, what is not in the frame, in the sense that it's very important to use people's capacity to dream about people to bring their own culture, their own background, their own history within the frame. And it's, you know, in cinema, it's very important because if you leave space for the imagination, then people can make it their own, because they will fill up the space, their own culture, with their own history, their own dreams, their own life. And if they do so, then it becomes theirs. Then they are, it's not something which is finished, completed, and that you're just looking from afar. It's something that you're looking at and you're completing it. And if you complete it, then it's yours. So you see in these photos, there's all this invitation to dialogues. Is it the technique? Is it the style? Is it the history? Is it the exchange? There's a lot of invitation to create, weave a narrative with your own legs and with your deambulation. And as you can see, the reflection of the artifacts and the public in the aluminium is somehow, you have all the fading away artifacts that are not here, because in this gallery you have only 250 artifacts from the hundreds of thousands that are in the Louvre in Paris. So they're all kind of, you know, they're the ghosts of all the others are there. And then you have with people, of course, which works even better, because the point is that this is to be with people. So every year, about 10% of the artifacts are changed, and they go back to Paris, and they're replaced by 10 other % that arrive from the Louvre, Paris. And we anticipated this rotation because it's almost like a living body, you know. And then, of course, we worked also on all the multimedia and all the elements. One specificities of the Louvre Lens, beyond the Galerie du Temps, is also that it has opened storage, which are visible and visitable with groups and guides. So this was a very important. And above these visible storage, we also designed all the multimedia. But nonetheless, we had a very long wall, which is quite boring, and we needed to have dragons on it to a certain extent. So we were thinking of what can we do with this wall? And that's where multimedia comes in, and that's why I want to explain this detail to you. That we thought in the middle of the galleries, in the middle of a collection, if you have screens, if you have multimedia, people are fascinated by moving image, and they will not look at the artifacts, because we are like this. We're like butterflies with candles. We go to the light and the moving light. So what if we gave glimpses? What if we gave a kind of a visual teaser, a visual literacy on how to look at the artifact that one will see afterwards in this wall? And I'd like to maybe use the Aga Khan Museum, which we did in Toronto with another Japanese architect, Fumihiko Maki, who's another Pritzker Prize. We worked with him, and I would like to introduce maybe with this project only what multimedia allows you and how I think multimedia should be used. So the Museum of the Aga Khan is a very different architecture. It's in Toronto in Canada, and it's an architecture of Maki that very much turns around a central courtyard. This glass courtyard, which is in the core of the building, and people turn around it and distribute auditorium, clock rooms, permanent galleries, restaurants. So it's a very much like a circumambulation. And of course, in Islam, it's almost you could say that it's almost a glass Kaaba, you know, the cube of Mecca, which is very important and around which you're supposed to turn. So this idea of circumambulation, of circulation, was very much at the core of the architecture of Fumihiko Maki. So to explain you briefly, what you see in green is the elements that we've modified or added, and the ones in red are the elements that we suppressed, because in the work with the curators, we needed to do some modification with the architects. And one of the key elements was, as an echo of this circulation, we wanted people to do the same circulation and go back into the rhythm as they come into the permanent galleries. And we knew that we had in the collection a couple artifacts around which that would create the same kind of circulation. A Mamluk fountain, a Safavid carpet, and here some Andalusia ceiling structure. So we knew that we could have the same kind of moments that would distribute the circulation. And the vestibule here, the entrance was here, so it was almost already in the middle of the gallery. So we needed to bring people to the very beginning so that they would do the full tour. So we created this wall, which is a bit, you know, like in the, pardon my pronunciation, but in Yuan, you know, in the traditional Chinese house, you have this wall with the 7 dragons so that the ghosts don't go in, you know, because they don't know how to walk sideways. So similarly, in Islamic traditional medieval architecture, you have a lot of thresholds, and the ideas of what's in-house, outside of the house, is very important. Intimacy, and usually you never step in a house immediately. You always have walls that creates kind of a threshold, and that's very important in Islamic architecture. So to a certain extent, building this wall was possible and legitimate. But nonetheless, we had a very long wall, which is quite boring, and we needed to have dragons on it to a certain extent. So we were thinking of what can we do with this wall? And that's where multimedia comes in, and that's why I want to explain this detail to you. Is that we thought in the middle of the galleries, in the middle of a collection, if you have screens, if you have multimedia, people are fascinated by moving image, and they will not look at the artifacts, because we are like this. We're like butterflies with candles. We go to the light and the moving light. So what if we gave glimpses? What if we gave a kind of a visual teaser, a visual literacy on how to look at the artifact that one will see afterwards in this wall? So you have to imagine that this is about 12 meters long, so people are walking along it. It's a succession of about I believe there's about 15 artifacts that we just looked at, and we gave them life, so that just to show people that you can look at things differently, and also understand that maybe how they are made, or maybe understand that this Iznik tile, which is from Turkish Ottoman Empire, in the gallery we only have 2. But if you look at them and you understand that it's not just a little nice decorative motif, it's actually pure geometry, it's fractal, it's pure mathematic, and it's an infinite motif. And this idea was to say, why don't along this walk, people come in and they try to understand or see maybe how what's behind the artifacts, and how do they function, how were they made, how were they calculated, or how does light influence them? And it's just about visual. And then when you will be in the gallery and you see them again, then you will see them and you will look at them differently. You know, multimedia is sometimes very risky in museums, because it's a kind of a it's, you know, like Ponce Pilate, you wash your hands and you say, okay, well, the multimedia will say it, the multimedia will bring it. And I think it's very important to find the same legitimacy to the multimedia to be there than for any other artifacts, so that it's not just a matter of screen where you move your greasy fingers on it, because we do that all day. You know, we all have fingers and we all play, and this is not bringing any meaning. But the question is, how do you bring the multimedia so that you are sure that it conveys something? Because my work is a work of a translator. My job is to translate the narrative and the content, which is the one brought by curators, brought by archaeologists, brought by the scientists and the knowledgeable. And how do you translate this into an experience? How do you translate it so that people, by walking, by looking, understand what is at stake? We have, on the contrary, we have a system in the wall, and the machine comes, picks up a stone, brings it, and it starts a little movie about the stone. So it becomes an editorial policy, because first year we might have 3 movies, second years we'll have 5, third year we'll have 10, and so forth. So it's a whole collections of small little movies on different stones that we can start imagining and producing. So it's not anymore one thing that will not last very long, but it's more a collection of books, like if you were doing mini little series on stones, and it's for the museum the capacity of being alive also. And in this regard, I'd like to talk about a project which is a building of Roman Antiquities Museum we're building in the south of France. And there again, the solution are not some kind of a design solution that are, making myself pleasure. I did a big drawing and that's it, it's done, it's over. But on the contrary, it's trying to find solutions that are from inside. What are we talking about? What is the subject? What is the nature of the collection? What are we trying to convey to the public? And this museum is only that. So Narbonne is the first capital of the Roman Empire in the former Gaelic, before it became France, country. And it's a crucial crossroad between Spain, Italy, and France. So it's a very important city, and it was the capital of the Roman. And they built lots of buildings in the beginning of the antiquities, but they destroyed everything themselves, because in the late antiquities, with Christianization, they started destroying the buildings that were pagans, and they started building the city walls of Narbonne. So they used some stones that were the ones of a tomb, the ones of a palace, the ones of a temple, and they used those stones to build the city walls. And as the Roman did, we dynamited all these walls when the trucks and cars and trains arrived, and we destroyed most of the city walls. And there's one guy who started collecting in the 19th century all the stones of interest and stacked them in a church where they stayed for 100 years. And we have about 1,500 of those stones, and the museum is about building something for this collection and also for a lot of other archaeological discoveries in the region, but to be able to create a museum which has also the archaeological laboratories on the one hand, but also the public museum on the other hand. And the question was, what do you do with 1,500 stones that each of them weighs about 1 ton? And if you look at the collections, you were like, okay, what are we looking at? We're looking at fragments. They are fragmentary. This is part of something else. These fragments all belong to monuments, either the Roman ones or the city walls. So they all belong to something which was monumental. And we need to offer the public a vision of it. The archaeological staff, we need to offer them the possibility to work with these stones and to move these stones. And we also need to convey the monumentality to which they belong. So if you add this up and you think, well, I got kind of a crazy idea, but which was to say, okay, why don't we just consider these as pixels of a larger image? And instead of having storage hidden from the public, the idea was, why don't we build a storage which is alive, which is visible, which is the natural frontier between the public and professional space, and that to a certain extent moves permanently, like you never step twice in the same museum. So it's a kind of a glyptothèque, a library of stones. And we designed the proper palettes for it. And then also it came and gave us the opportunity of saying, well, instead of having a multimedia which is dedicated to one stone here in the permanent display, we have, on the contrary, we have a system in the wall, and the machine comes, picks up a stone, brings it, and it starts a little movie about the stone. So it becomes an editorial policy, because first year we might have 3 movies, Second years, we'll have 5. Third year, we'll have 10, and so forth. So it's a whole collections of small little movies on different stones that we can start imagining and producing. So it's not anymore one thing that will not last very long, but it's more a collection of books, like if you were doing mini little series on stones, and it's for the museum the capacity of being alive also. So this wall became the backbone, the spine of the building, and it's 90 meter long, it's 12 meter high, and it separates in a very porous way, very transparent kind of, the whole building in two. And then we also worked on the basis of Roman architecture legacy and structures and traditions of hiding from the sun, using a courtyard and circulation of the air, working with the light of the oculus, as many elements as courtyards inside, so that we could root the design of the building into the culture and the very object of the museum, which is the Roman antiquities. And after 8 years of long patience, the wall is now alive and it's starting to be filled. We're starting to put the stones inside. So it's a long process because we have over 800 stones to put inside, and the machine runs. So it's quite impressive, but for us it's a great satisfaction because now we're working with the curators and we're working with the archaeologists. For the first time, they have the capacity of moving their collection the way they want, and we're creating scenarios and script so that the machine will, while the public is there, organize the stones in different schemes and different scenarios. And in terms of architecture, you can see that there is a zenithal light just above that wall, and actually the two buildings have been built like two buildings, and they join with a gap. That gap is the ceiling natural light that falls onto the library of stone. So there's a whole game of natural light on the stones that we are now working and anticipating to develop as the stones are coming in. And we are starting to install the permanent gallery, and that's the last part of this project. So you see the scale, the very subject is the one that brought the solution. And rather than trying to do some preconceived or foreign or alien solutions, aesthetic solutions, the idea was to concentrate on what is the subject, what are we conveying, and what did Giacometti do, and what was he doing, and how do we translate this so that people can almost understand it without reading anything, just by feeling. I would like to show you maybe another scale and another time frame of project, because you've seen two projects which are very long, breathtaking, 5 years, 9 years, 10 years of work. Another part of our work is to work with temporary exhibitions. These ones are totally different, and they're different in the project because a curator is gathering artifacts for a specific exhibition which will last 3 months, 4 months. So it's very, very different scale. And also because usually in a temporary exhibition you have to say there's a very clear narrative and focus, whereas maybe in a permanent gallery you have to have many layers of capacities of reading the gallery so that you come back, and every time you come back you see something else, you read something else. In a temporary gallery or in a temporary show, maybe the focus is more acute on 1 or 2 or 3 narrative, that's about it. So this is an exhibition on Giacometti, which I did and designed for the Hughes Museum in Shanghai of Bouditech, and the curator was Catherine Grenier. And the Hughes Museum, who has an extension which was designed by a Japanese architect, has the specificities of this great hangar. And this is a former plane garage. So it's huge, it's massive, it's extraordinarily big. And the curator, Catherine Grenier, was very scared of this space and very reluctant to use it. She said, maybe we just use the lateral galleries, which are more classical little spaces, because this is too big for Giacometti. But for me, if you were to do something in the Hughes Museum, you had to use this space, because otherwise, why go there? You know, if you're not using the iconic great hall of the Hughes Museum, you could be anywhere else. It was not very interesting. And also, this question of scale, and that's what I told, because she told me, the curator, Catherine Grenier, she told me about the importance of scale in the work of Giacometti. So I said, well, you know, maybe that's the challenge. The challenge and the questions of scale is a way of carrying the subject of scale, which is at the core of the work of Giacometti, and bring it into the space of the Hughes Museum. And that question of scale, what is big, what is small, Giacometti talks about trying to sculpt people that are 100 meters away. In these photos, who is small, who is big? Is it him, is it the sculptures? You don't really know. And also, he worked all his life in a studio which was 30 meters square. And he'd never had a huge studio like contemporary artists have today. He worked all his life in this very small studio in Paris. And the question of scale is really at the core of his work. And the last work he did in his life was for New York. It was for the Chase Manhattan Piazza competition. And he went to, it was on the last moments of his life, and he stopped the project because he said he didn't understand the scale of New York, and he didn't understand the scale of the Chase Manhattan Piazza. And finally, the project was done by Gardère. And the sculptures he had made for this Chase Manhattan project were the walking man, the standing woman, and the head, which are the iconic works that he had envisioned in the first place for New York. So this is a small video we did many months before the opening of the exhibition. And the idea was to show that we would reverse the way the museum functioned, in the sense that instead of entering the Great Hall, we would bring people to the upper floor and the mezzanine, so that they would first start with the natural classic galleries, and they would, from the mezzanine, see the Great Hall from above, which would shift the scale. And once again, just like the terrace and the Louvre Lens, you're putting people in a position where they're not dominated, but they are in a position where you change the scale. And then we made the real exhibition. So there was also some elements to evocate his studio, his atelier, the beginnings of his work when he comes from cubism to surrealism, into thin air when the sculptures like thins and becomes almost unpalpable. The obsessions of the heads with this work of heads and sculpting that he carried all his life long. And in the Great Hall, we tried to evocate almost the structures and the proportion of his studio with the four major models that he worked on all his life with. And as an evocation of a possible kind of New York, but also a way of, how would you say that? These are the columns of the building, and we drown them, we erase them into this other kind of skyline of forms, just very simple shapes, element that almost creates with the steps the same kind of an evocation, a far evocation of this Chase Manhattan project, of which he never did, but for which he did these three sculptures. And this was a solution to subdivide the Great Hall, but let the air pass, not build walls, not close the vision, but on the contrary, play with what you are seeing through, not seeing through, and how people walked on the other side where you had the cafe, where you had a shop, where you had a photo booth, and people could get glimpses of what's happening behind the towers and behind the city. And we even pushed the metaphor further, because we had the little first model bronze of Giacometti, of these big ones. So for them, we created the same decor of the big ones in the case in which they were. And behind you had the cafe, you had the photo booth, and you had this whole activities of the rest of the museum. So you see the scale, the very subject, is the one that brought the solution. And rather than trying to do some preconceived or foreign or alien solutions, aesthetic solutions, the idea was to concentrate on what is the subject, what are we conveying, and what did Giacometti do, and what was he doing, and how do we translate this so that people can almost understand it without reading anything, just by feeling. So maybe on the other parts, to a certain extent, they were more classic in a way, because there was one which was explaining the movement from Cubism to Surrealism, which is the beginning of his practice, which you can see for everyone here. Then there was this notion of the obsessions of the heads, where we worked willingly this very repetitive, very systematic display system to underline there again the obsession of doing heads all along. This part was almost trying to be like the sketches and the etching that were done by Giacometti in Paris, which in all the café he traveled through, and he was doing these sketches, and we tried to almost just do the sketches in space, I would say. Well, the white is not his color, yes and no, because I mean Giacometti is not a man of color that much. I mean, it's a shades of gray, if one can still use this word, shades of white, shades of gray, and but there's not that much of color. And I think that in this sense, probably did we want to I think I didn't want to introduce color because I didn't want to create a background. I don't think I wanted to create a stage or create something that could have become decorative. And I wanted to be as much as possible a step away, to let the art just be, just be almost absent, which is not true because we're not absent. It was overly designed, but overly designed in the sense that it was detailing design, but the design, I hope, was there in the right way, I hope. So we created and we designed a kind of a contemporary koinobori, very simple profile of textile, and we imagine with Reiko a huge, enormous school of fish that would, to a certain extent, create the movement, allow us to exhibit her textile, and create movement just without movement, but just by the movement given and created by the fish and the koinobori themselves. And I'll finish with not an exhibition, but more an installation, which I think is another reflection on how do you respond to a problem. The problem was Reiko Sudo, who is a great Japanese textile designer, Reiko Sudo. She is in Japan, she's in Tokyo, she has a great company called NUNO Corporation, and they make incredible textiles. And the problem is, how do you exhibit textiles? Because it's very difficult to exhibit textile, because by definition, textile is beautiful when it's in movement, when it's carried and wear by people, when you can see the wind in it. But in a museum, textile is often flat and vertical, and it's very difficult to give it life. So I discussed a lot with Reiko-san, and I was thinking, where do we find movement and textile in the traditions of Japan? And you're very familiar, I know, in China also, there's a big Chinese tradition of the koinobori and the koi fish, which is very auspicious, is a great goodwill artifact. And in Japan, the koinobori is this almost this wind socks kite that is used to celebrate young boys and to celebrate every year their birth. And you have this very, very grand traditions of koinobori. And they are by numbers like this, waving in the wind. So if you reverse the question and you want to bring movement and to something which is static, well, School of Fish is something which is quite incredible. You have the murmuration of the birds, you have the School of Fish, you know, all these things where you can feel the movement, even if it's just a photo, because it's a general, enormous movement. So we created and we designed a kind of a contemporary koinobori, very simple profile of textile. And we imagine with Reiko a huge, enormous school of fish that would, to a certain extent, create the movement, allow us to exhibit her textile, and create movement just without movement, but just by the movement given and created by the fish and the koinobori themselves. And that's what we created in the National Art Center Tokyo, in the largest temporary exhibition room there is in Tokyo. And what was beautiful is that it didn't move, nothing moved, but people could only see movement. And the textile was floating, and the fish were moving, and it was incredible. We got like over 150,000 visitors for an exhibition of textile, which is quite a lot. And just to say that if you, once again, it's just like the knife I started with, if you look at things with attention and you seek for the solution from within, then I think you can find solutions that are not only relevant, but that address everyone, and that in which everyone can find himself. 谢谢。